Hey, Dr. Brett. It's me, as always, feeling a bit angsty. Lots going on in the world, more stuff going on in the world than I'd like to be going on, particularly because a lot of it just seems to be the same old nonsense over and over again. And it's got me thinking a lot about this sort of perpetual millennial angst I find myself in that I'm constantly feeling like the shoe is about to drop. Just event after event, global catastrophe, pandemic, recession, depression, wars, all of these waves that have consistently happened in the course of my lifetime and also in your lifetime as millennials. And I'd love to talk a little bit about that in the context of what's happening right now in the news cycle, but also in the ways that we find reprieve, the way that we find respite in all of this. Because I certainly know that as a millennial, I am very happy to dwell on the nonsense that keeps happening, but also pretty good at finding a meme or a joke or something to try to make light of it. So this week, let's get angsty. Let's talk about millennial angst. This is the Doc to Doc podcast.
It's voice notes turned podcast. Place as perspective. And welcome back, folks, to the Doc to Doc podcast. I am Dr. Brett, coming to you from Southern California.
Hey, folks, I'm Nicole. I'm coming to you from my iPhone in Tempe, Arizona. Disclosure, we, haven't quite figured out, or I haven't quite figured out how to do pod on the road, but I know we're here. We're here. So shout out to that iPhone 4 Max.
And a little tease for you folks. This on the road tech figuring out situation may be put to use later in the season. We will find out together. So stay tuned for that.
Exactly.
Well, coming off of our last episode on curiosity and joy, which was not without its heavier moments. I think we had some thoughts on where this episode was going to go, and then between recording, which was a quick turnaround between recording and when it posted, and when we are recording this episode, our thoughts that this episode on millennial angst, I think, took a predictable turn. So tell me more about what inspired your podcast.
As you noted, Brett, I mean, I genuinely was already kind of feeling, as one millennial does, a little angsty, a little fiery, coming off the last couple of topics, wanting to talk about millennial angst and wanting to talk about sort of this constant current, I think, that is flowing through most millennials' lives of sort of waiting for the shoe to drop. And I'll talk a little bit more about that on the pod. But I was thinking about that. I think we had set it up, and then it's like we should have knocked on wood or something. I don't know what sort of karmic, luck magic thing we should have done to avoid one of said currents or one of these said waves of millennials' lives, which is, bombing Muslim and Arab countries. So I woke up, as I think most folks did, bright and early and bushy-tailed Saturday morning, and the news of military action and strikes in Iran, and then seeing the retaliation in the Gulf, that was already on my news feed. And I was like, God damn it. Sometimes you set up a topic perfectly with intention, and sometimes you do it without intention. And I think we have kind of a bit of both in this situation, but I was like, fuck, did I speak this into action, or is this just the nonsense of being a millennial, which is you go to sleep and the next day you wake up and we're at war, or we're in a recession, or blah, blah, blah.
Yeah, it is a incessant news cycle. This is one of those topics where I think we want to be surprised that this is where we are, but especially for millennials, this has been our entire adult lives, has been one kind of catastrophic international crisis, often of our own making, our meaning the United States. As is the case now, we are at the whim of boomers who refuse to give up the levers of power. And I think it's fair to say for the audience, just so that folks can kind of emotionally and intellectually prepare for this episode, that we are going to talk about geopolitical realities, but it's not our areas of expertise. I don't think, we're not going to spend too much time on the intricacies or the specifics of nonstop war in the Middle East, but it will certainly be something that keeps coming up because it is the cyclical nature of the last 25 years at least, and obviously more than that. But thinking about millennials as adults, that's kind of the time period that we're looking at.
Yeah, and I appreciate you say that because I think that this is one of the core tenets of our podcast, which is approaching topics from the perspective of experience, the perspective of place, and particularly as it relates to some of those geopolitics. We've also teased that we, might be seeing other faces other than us on the pod in the future, and I think that's a good opportunity for us to invite someone who has that expertise. I do think that some of the things that we'll be hinting at or just sort of rounding about in today's episode also have to do with the continued legacy in this country that we've never really shaved off in the US of empire and colonialism. But I also anticipate us to kind of similar that we did for our episode 2. If folks haven't listened on the US American Gestapo, probably going more into detail about the historical background on that in a future episode, since it is sort of one of those things that, like I said, the U.S. just never has shaken off. As much as we love to sort of talk about that being in the past, Dr. Brett, you and I very much know that very much not in the past. But yeah, today I guess maybe stepping slightly back of the events over the weekend. When I was thinking about today and when I was originally crafting you a little voice note, I suppose like I would dock the conversation in a conversation that I think I've had multiple times post graduation for sure, but with intensity probably in the last 18 months. I've had a conversation with friends and colleagues that seems like a Groundhog Day conversation. I kind of feel like I'm having it over and over again with people in different places, feeling like something is going to happen, that the conditions around me or friends or colleagues are such that they're so unstable that we sort of never feel like we're getting ahead or that there's never a right time to do something. Where the conversation usually starts is we're talking about something that is very much part of sort of the American dream, which is like, where do you live? Are you thinking about buying a home? And me and my friends sort of bitching about or talking about in some way, shape, or form the fact that the majority of us are renters. Many of us have, lived with parents in adulthood or have moved back and kind of had these little intermezzos, but we're all renting, and a lot of us are living in incredibly expensive cities, regardless of the current economic climate. I live in Washington, D.C. I know you live in Orange County, Brett, LA, friends in Pasadena, friends in Boston, New York City. These are spaces that we know generally have kind of been expensive. But then I also have friends who live in more rural areas, sort of in Georgia, in the deep South, maybe middle of the country, Oklahoma City kind of places that also are getting more expensive. And we're talking about we're in our, early to mid to late 30s, early 40s, mid 40s, and all of us are sitting there being like, I can't afford a house yet. And just sort of having that be the basis of the conversation. And then it always makes me think of this meme that's like, I'm sure you've seen it. It's like, oh man, like back in the 2008 financial crisis, like I should have been buying homes instead of playing Just Dance and dancing to Rasputin. Damn it, like hindsight. That's when I should have been investing in property so that future me, future Nicole today could have that sort of quintessential, and I'd love your thought on this as somebody who like thinks about home and making home, that quintessential sort of stepping stone, which also I think is sort of synonymous with stability and feeling comfort and feeling safe in the US, but maybe other places as well, which is building a home and having a foundation that is not movable, that's not just renting, but it's something that you invest in and that actually places you somewhere, as opposed to kind of always feeling like I don't have the finances, or I'm not ready to, or I'm going to have to move again in 12 months, right?
Yeah, well, and placing it to 2008 is funny to me because I didn't have the capital to buy a home in
Okay.
2008. You know, I was 3 years out of undergrad living in New
Hmm.
York City. 2008, let's see, I think I would have recently have moved out of the apartment that I was in with my partner that we had with two roommates. And one of my last roommates, I should mention, friend of the pod, Matt Bogdanow, who created and recorded our jingle,
Hmm.
was a roommate of mine in Brooklyn. And yeah, it was a struggle every time we had to move apartments, even if it was around the block. It is expensive to move and to pay broker's fees at that time, to pay for movers, to get the things that you need to kickstart a new apartment. You often have like down payments on
Hmm.
utilities and things, first and last month's rent plus security deposit. Living is really a stretch of our means. And I've never been in a position to consider buying property because I don't have generational wealth
Yeah.
to pay a down payment. And my assumption is that most of my friends who have been fortunate enough to buy and own were given some level of capital investment from family. That is a wonderful thing. That is what property ownership has always supposed to be in this country.
Hmm.
It is the way to move up the economic class. Is through owning property, and it becomes more valuable, and then you sell it and you get the next thing.
Right.
Or some folks, as they get older, sell it, downsize what they need, and then gift some of that money to um, the next generation to buy, or they gift the house
Hmm.
to the next generation. And that has just never been my reality. I don't expect it ever will be. And that's also not only a financial thing, but also getting into the topic about millennial angst. That's also anxiety. It's wanderlust and not
Hmm.
feeling settled in place. And it's been a long time. And I think we'll get into this throughout the pod, but it's been a very long time for me since I have been able to envision for myself what being settled in place would look like.
Yeah.
Part of that is mental illness. Part of that is the exact realities that we're going to talk about throughout the pod today. Of it is difficult for me to envision the future. That has, in part, to give it a positive spin, that helps me be present in the moment because I'm not always working for the next thing or moving towards the next thing. It is, in part, trying to be present and fulfilled by what I'm doing now, but it is also in reaction to the fact that I very much struggle to envision a future for myself.
Yeah.
But to kind of take the conversation back a little bit, we're referring to millennial angst, and we're talking about
Hmm.
our age group, which you and I do have a difference in our ages. We've alluded to it. We've hinted at things in the pod. I identify as an elder millennial,
Hmm.
which I believe is the folks born like 78 to 83. I think we're kind of on the tail end of Gen X. I grew up very much wanting to be a Gen Xer, but I was too young. Um, and millennials are folks who grew up knowing life before the internet. I was in junior high the first time I remember doing. I don't think there was Google yet. It was like web crawler and Yahoo were like some of the
Mm.
first internet searches. And so our becoming of exploring the world and forming our identities existed at that cusp of time
Right.
before the internet and then with the internet. And so where do you place yourself and how do you kind of
Oh,
identify the marker of being a millennial?
yeah. So I'm at the exact opposite end of the tail. I am where the tail ends.
Mm,
And so I'm in the last few years of the early 90s where the internet exists, doesn't exist yet, and then suddenly appears right while I am in my formative cute toddler years. So it's out there, but a lot of folks, including my parents for sure, do not know how to use it.
mm,
And it's something that's exciting and shiny and fun, but the literacy is not mass spread. The way that I think about it is By the time that I was probably able to use a computer and go on the internet, definitely remember dial-up, AOL, all of the sort of difficulties of having to plug in one's computer to the phone line, which then made the phone line
Hmm.
not usable, and you would get really pissed.
Sometimes if
Or
you got a phone call, it would kick someone else off of the internet.
I distinctly, my grandfather would pick me up on my mom's side. My mother's father would pick me up once a week for a couple of years in school on Wednesdays. And I distinctly remember I would always call him because she would say, "You need to just confirm," even though this was the rule of the game, that he was going to show up every Wednesday and like knew. She's always like, "Just call him to make sure." And I distinctly remember calling him, and every fucking time I would call him. This man was on the internet. He worked for Honeywell and was kind of a computer guy, but it was always just the and I was like, and so you just keep calling and trying until maybe he was off. So so where I'm going with that is I remember it being part of my life, but also not a lot of people around me had a tech savviness or could afford a lot
Mm,
of fancy sort of electronics equipment because electronics are still pretty expensive, and
mhm,
even like televisions and things. So a lot of my upbringing was immersed in this, but it was also, I felt like compared to my parents, I was being taught in school how to start using electronics to be a tool. So I remember we had to take
mm,
typing classes when I was in the third
mhm.
grade,
Yep.
and that was an assignment. And that we when we got a computer room at the school that you could go on, that was where you would do a lot of your research or homework if you had to do something. But it was still very much a combination of, you would go to the computer room or the library, you might have some computer access time to do assignments, but there were only a few computers. If we went to a school that had a computer for everyone, that was pretty major. So most of the time, you still would then have the librarian have a rolled book cart, which would have all of the resources based on your topic that you would submit ahead of time, so that you could, in a combination, use that plus go to the stacks and still try to find things. I don't think I would say it was like analog versus digital, but I feel like
Mhm.
I still didn't have a full integration in sort of the internet era, probably until I was in middle school or high school, at the time when social media was finally kind of mass marketed for folks. And that's also when I got a cell phone, so that kind of changed the game.
What age were you when you got a cell phone?
I was 14 when I got a cell phone, which
Wow.
felt pretty old at the time.
Yeah, especially
Uh,
nowadays.
I think I was 13 because I do remember my
Mm,
first phone was one of those flip-up phones that had the
yeah.
keyboard. It was a present before I went into high school, as like a graduation. So I remember that. It was called the
Yeah.
Scoop, the Alltel Scoop, and it was baby blue. Yeah, I don't know. So,
I don't remember I don't think mine was called anything. I think it was just the flip phone available.
mm,
But
yeah.
I got my first cell phone right before I left for undergrad,
Oh, dang.
18, heading to New York. I remember in junior high and then early high school, occasionally I would take my dad's pager so that my friends could get in touch with me. Pagers were all the rage in the mid 90s.
Mm,
And then my dad got a cell phone earlier than the rest of us for work, and occasionally based on like where I was going, if we were driving downtown, we would take his cell phone so that we could be in contact with folks. It's one of the things that we often joke about, especially with my friends and coworkers who have kids, of just saying how different it is. They
hmm
have apps with their kids in nursery school or kindergarten where like you could basically watch a live stream now of your child at school, and they get
Yeah.
like sometimes incessant updates about what the kids are doing at school. And we joke that like our parents used to drop us off at the mall and someone else's parents were supposed to pick us up. Hopefully that happened. Or in the summer, I would just get on my bike and ride off, into the sunrise. And then my parents, I think, probably hoped and figured I would show up at some point, or they'd get a call. We used to have to call collect, and
Mm.
you would talk so fast and you just say, it's Brett, pick me up at the Citgo on Central. And that was the name. You have a collect call from It's Brett, pick me up at the Citgo on Central. And that's how we survived. And that is we go there to have some levity, to kind of
Mhm.
place us in time and space as millennials. But then we weren't angsty yet.
No, no.
Not that it started, because obviously I did have angst, and I've talked about mental illness at length on the pod, as a preteen and teen. But that was, I was about to say disconnected from current events until I think I'm going to place us in time in a moment. But I actually want to correct it. I was about to start talking about 9/11 as being often the thing that millennials point to. As for me, that was 2 weeks into undergrad, and I was in New York City for 9/11. And that we can look at the nonstop train wreck of current events since 9/11. But I can actually go 2 years earlier, April 1999, and the mass shooting at Columbine. 9/11 obviously hit close to home, and I'm sorry for the pun on that one, folks, because I was in New York. But there was also something about Columbine that was so close to home because it was in high school, and that was a place where we were supposed to be safe, where we were supposed to be kids, and that was kids turning on kids. And that also has set this foundation now for children today still have such a different reality and connection to school because school shootings have become an almost daily occurrence in this country. And so the anxiety that comes with that for the younger generations, I cannot even fathom, because
No.
Columbine was
Right.
this wake up. I don't know how I want to categorize it, but it still didn't totally feel possible. Like, I was not worried about there being a school shooting at my high school. And I don't think that is the reality for most children today.
Yeah. I think it's interesting that you mentioned that because I'm trying to place school shootings and the intensity of them in my primary school through high school experience. And we had lockdown drills where you turn off the lights. The teacher would, if there was a window in the door, there would be something to that the school had given them or they had fashioned themselves that would cover that so no one could see in. And then there would also be a sort of a mandate to either go under your desk or like go to a portion of the classroom that was like the furthest from the door, and you would just wait
Mm-hmm.
and you would and it was always sort of positioned as if there was an intruder on campus or on the school grounds of like somebody who wasn't supposed to be there, but it always felt kind of like a fire drill and that okay, we do this every once in a while just to kind of understand, but it didn't feel heavy in that sense. And by the time that Sandy Hook happened, I had just recently graduated high school, and I think there was momentum, but it kind of felt like this was something that was possible, but it didn't seem to happen with the frequency that it does now. So I would be very interested in sort of Gen Z forward, how they think about that, because to
Mm-hmm.
me, it felt routine and that it was related to a fire drill, but it didn't feel in the way that we were taking precaution or the way that it was already institutionalized as a result of Columbine. It didn't feel like it was something that was present of like, oh, I think this is going to happen, or I assume it's one of my peers or someone is coming on, and it just felt more routine, I suppose.
To go 2 years later from Columbine, 9/11 is the moment that a lot of folks, millennials in particular, point to as being the first tick on the timeline of, because I think for elder millennials, that was either the start of undergrad or maybe 2, 3 years into undergrad. And that is the point in our lives when we are becoming adults. I've talked about that one of the reasons why I identify as a New Yorker is because it is where I grew up as an adult. It is where I chose to be, make a career, try to build my life. And that formation began with 9/11. Pretty quickly after 9/11, the drums of war started to beat, and it became just overwhelmingly clear that we were going to war in Afghanistan, and then for some unknown reason, also in Iraq. And there was a protest that I remember going to on the west side of Manhattan. At the time, it was identified as being one of the largest gatherings in history, particularly in modern US history. There were 1 million people protesting the invasion of Iraq. And it had no impact. And there was this moment in that where I felt the futility and the powerlessness of modern politics. And it was reminiscent to me of, I was a student of the Vietnam War and the counterculture. It was very formative to who I was growing up in music and in movies, but also recognizing that the anti-war protests had little impact ultimately on ending the
Right.
war in Vietnam. And so it felt like we were in a cycle. Like this is happening again. This is going to be my generation's Vietnam. It obviously played out differently, but I think it had a similar impact on our generation, that inability to have influence on what is happening in our name.
I was still in primary school when it happened. Um, I do remember sort of classic kid moment, just coming out, waking up, eating some Lucky Charms, and walking into the living room, and my mom was at the TV, and I saw the second tower get hit, and
Mm,
um, that's my recollection. Not being in New York, being in Arizona, seeing that from afar, like I think a lot of people did, was not something that at the time I think I had enough emotional or maturity, kind of the capacity to quite understand, but it was something that became very prevalent even in school. I remember we had a lot of assignments related to kind of trying to work through our feelings about what was happening,
mm,
trying to think about a lot of people being deployed. And then suddenly there was this sort of mass patriotism that I think my parents certainly took up, being more conservative. And suddenly every house had an American flag if they hadn't before. And it was. Um, an interesting time, but it did feel sort of like an emotional shift that even if the time I wasn't able to fully understand in the same way that you would have been if you were in college, and were able to actually think about, the politics of it all. I just saw people in my neighborhood, people at my school, my teachers, my parents, my older sister who was in high school acting very differently. And then
mm,
what was taught to us, at least in schools, was a very heavy patriotism that I now recognize and would problematize as being very anti-Muslim. That's kind of maybe on the tail end of, I think, of millennials, is that I think a lot of us didn't have that critical skill set yet to really understand how we were being indoctrinated with a lot of pro-US propaganda, such that, by the time I went to university, I had to get my shit checked on, a lot of my internalized kind of racism and Islamophobia, and that sort of thing that was mass sort of spread at the time, and not excusable, but something that you suddenly have language for why you don't like people, and it's very
mm.
stereotypical, and I don't remember having that previously, but I do remember having it after that, and that was very much tied to the importance and the significance of this particular event in the context of it being very tragic and devastating.
So if 9/11, if we're going to use that as the start of the millennial angst timeline, we hit the
Hmm.
25th anniversary last September. That was sort of a bonkers realization of how old I am. But if that's where we're starting with things, let's our listeners through the timeline. So
Mm.
Nicole, what is your sort of millennial greatest hits
Mm.
timeline of impact?
Yeah, yeah, I'm thinking about like an infomercial late at night, also very 90s, early aughts. Like, now that's what I call jazz. And now that's what I call millennial angst. Okay, so
That is an album I do not want.
you sure? I don't know. I'm sure there's some bops on there because
I'll
if
stick with my
anything,
jock jams.
I do think that no matter what, a defining part of millennial angst at the top is memes and laughter. So I'm like, I don't know what
Mm,
Gen Z is giving us, or Gen Z, depending on where you are in the world listening. I don't know what they're giving us, but I'm like, we gave the world memes, and
yeah.
that's pretty funny. Okay, so see what I'm doing? I'm like avoiding going through these if I being self-deprecating. Okay, so now, I think then the next big one is the '08 collapse. I think that's the
Mm,
next, because things after that, I mean, we only recently actually ended the conflict in Afghanistan, which is pretty wild. I mean, that went on for what, 20 years. So, there's a point where being in conflict, I think, just becomes kind of normalized, and it becomes background noise, at least in my experience, in that, we still have a conflict, but it's not, once George Bush was sort of outed for his nonsense, and Colin Powell and all of, that administration, I think we then have Obama, and things look exciting. Things are hopeful, although not in my household at the time, because I was, remember, still
mm.
very evangelical and very Christian. So my mom thought that Obama was the Antichrist. So that was definitely
Wow.
going on in the background. We were a John McCain family, but
Arizona as well.
Arizona as well. Yeah. So I think then the '08 crisis right around Obama. So there's this intersection of things feeling really hopeful, at least around me, not in my circle, but people around me at school and so on and so forth. And then the '08 financial crisis is big. My dad pours concrete. He works in construction, and I remember watching his decline financially be pretty intense, going from working all the time to not working. And he had just built a house and like kind of his dream home post my parents' divorce, kind of his first big piece of property. Just sort of watching the house get built, but then never get furnished fully because
Mhm.
you get this, and then realizing why are the lights off? Why, what's going on? Hearing about, the financial issues that are going on with him on in the background. And then, of course, the financial crisis leading to a lot of people being out of work. I remember a lot of friends and family members um, trying to sell their house, going into bankruptcy. And people just seemed to really be struggling and knew that was going on, still was playing a lot of Just Dance, Rasputin, What a Bop. And well, then after that, you have, Trump 1.0, I think, which was pretty devastating for a lot of people, myself included. Um, there is COVID-19, which is really hard to think that that was about 7 years ago. I mean, you talked about
Oh
9/11
my
being
God.
25 years. I mean, 7 years ago. At this point in the timeline, you and I know each other. We actually see each other at Lux Coffee on Central, doing a little dissertation writing as we would at a coffee shop, as we do.
Spring
Kind
break
of
for us.
spring break, watching everything shut down. On the big screen that they don't have anymore, but they used to have this big projector
Oh,
screen, and yeah, they shut that off. I think it's like a speakeasy now, is
well,
that side of the
and what was so interesting about that moment, and just to jump in very quickly, is
yeah.
it felt so cinematic, like being in a movie, because the news that we were getting that really signaled to us that something is about to happen was
Mm-hmm.
not CNN, it was ESPN.
It was
And it
ESPN.
was the news that the basketball season was pausing and
Hmm.
spring break was pausing for 2 weeks.
Yeah,
And
no,
that
I
was
that
the
was wild.
indication that like shit is about to turn.
Right, because you and I both know, like, sports are the last thing to go. I mean, the things that keep people going are entertainment, and
Hmm.
when entertainment leaves, like that was wild. Yeah, so watching that live time, and then of course, COVID, the pandemic, lockdown, isolation. You and I both were very intentional in our isolation period. I didn't see anyone for a year beyond the people that I lived with. Then coming out of that, financial crisis again, a little, is this the depression or the recession? I don't know. Like they're all like just, shit prospects. Everybody's
Yeah.
buying a house who can, the markets are going up. Everything's just getting inflated, hyperinflation. Trump 2.0, everything we've been talking about on the pod, the Venezuela stuff. Prior to that, the war in Ukraine with Russia, and then now we're bombing Iran. So I think those are my greatest hits. I'm sure I missed a lot, but I would say
Mm.
that it's always just sort of like one wave after the next crashing onto the sand of, just when you think you're like, I think I can go to bed and have a nice night. I'm going to wake up tomorrow. I'm going to get my coffee. I'm going to, this is what I'm going to do with my weekend. It's going to be great. It's all coming up, Nicole. And then you wake up and you see the headlines and you're just like, fuck. Okay. All right.
Mm.
Like, probably should have seen that coming. But I think those are my general hits. If I'm putting this onto a compilation, if I was making a mixtape or a mix CD, I'll put
Yeah.
those on there. Any ads, any changes? What's yours, Dr. Brett?
So I was jotting down some notes as you were talking. I think we have a lot of overlapping singles. There were a few
Mhm.
other things that I did want to mention, and adding some additional thoughts to a couple. So if we're starting at 9/11, and then just the Bush years,
Mm.
and the overwhelming ineptitude that it seemed of him, and acting as this puppeteer for both Dick Cheney as well as clearly oil companies, war profiteering. Then last week we talked about hope, and there is a very interesting connection into the rhetoric of the Obama campaign. It was all about there are some interesting things there. I don't know if we'll get into it too much, but that the hope of that campaign did not turn into the action of his presidency. And there have been some interesting think pieces about how he intentionally or not did not capitalize on the ground game that he built in order to get himself elected. They did not maintain those networks. They dismantled them so that there was not connection from the grassroots that got him elected, did not continue to have access to power when he started governing. And then we saw the impacts of that with the financial crisis when he bailed out the banks and not individuals. And like you said, with the example with your dad and the house, I had a 401k for my first job. And with the financial collapse, I saw that halve. I lost half of that money. And it was not a significant amount because it had only been a few years, but I had a couple bonuses that were paid as 401ks. So I saw it get wiped out. And I understand what was happening to other folks because I saw what happened in that account for me. But even to back it up just a tiny bit, that campaign between him and McCain, we have not seen a Republican like McCain since McCain. Someone who is trying to play to the middle, trying to be kind of a reasonable, still very much a right-wing politician, but he makes a very intentional choice that has been devastating to our political landscape, which was to bring on Sarah Palin as his running mate. And that was a culture shift in our politics. She set the stage for Trump in a lot of ways that I don't know if we give her credit for, and that the blame has to go to McCain. He made a calculation that he needed the far right, and she was the means to do that, where he could utilize her as the voice piece. He could still pretend that he was playing to the middle while placating the far right. And that has been devastating, not only here, but abroad, and set the stage for MAGA and Trumpism. Then for me, some of these millennial moments are my engagement with the Occupy Wall Street movement and experiencing state repression. Felt like we were living COINTELPRO, felt like we had Black Panthers that came and talked to us and sharing the echoes of what they had experienced, and just the violent hand of the state to crush dissent, to crush youth voices who were crying out for the support of the government that many of us campaigned and canvassed and worked to try to get Obama elected, and we felt abandoned. And we saw our futures being leveraged to save bankers and to build pipelines. This was a big part of activism in the early years, was around anti-tar sands and oil pipelines and gas pipelines that are destroying the planet. And the background of everything we are talking about today is climate disaster. And it's one of the things that we don't talk about a lot because it feels so out of our scope of control.
Yeah.
Another big component, especially in New York, with the Occupy Wall Street movement was activism against stop and frisk and the targeting of young Black men by the NYPD. That was a movement that kind of evolved into the movement for Black Lives, the Black Lives Matter movement, because of the amount of televised, recorded, public executions of Black men. And it is important to note that the Black Lives Matter movement started under Obama when Trayvon Martin was murdered in his neighborhood, and then Freddie Gray, Breonna Taylor, and on and on and on. And Obama never took a strong stand. And did not use his platform to talk about police violence. Then, as you mentioned, Trump 1.0, which in my opinion, Hillary was never the candidate, but it was devastating that the potential for our first woman president lost to Trump. And that was symbolic in such devastating ways. Then next moment, the Me Too movement and this push for accountability against sexual violence, in part because of how blatant Trump was in his own sexual violence, which we now know is exponentially worse than we knew at the time. And then, yes, COVID, and now Trump 2.0. And so it is just a litany of emotionally and psychologically devastating moments that we often feel powerless to have any kind of substantive impact.
I really appreciate you contextualizing even the things that I was saying with the sort of additional bullet points. It's just like a long, robust outline of just shit happening over and over and over again. And as I said before, it's every time things sort of seem to smooth, we recover, we're thinking, okay, things are going to get better. We got the little sprinkle of hope. We get the rejection of Donald Trump. Forgot to mention the insurrection. I mean, that fucking happened.
Fucking hell, yeah. And
We
no
get by.
accountability. Again, it's one of those moments where
No, no. I
it was,
mean,
I remember that was still during the pandemic. I remember watching that live happen. And
yeah,
we all watched it live. And that was one
I'll
of those
watch it live.
moments of we're being
Just
told that what we saw did not happen.
right, right, or it's minimized. I mean, yeah, you and I could both have a full episode on as much as we complain about Republicans of like, all of our grievances with Democrats because I don't know about you, but for me they're also pretty fucking high. Yeah, I think it was one of the travesties of the Biden administration was that Merrick Garland was intentionally selected because they knew that he wouldn't pursue justice
Yeah.
for Trump. And then, what happens? Trump day one pardons all of these people. And every time you get this hint of reprieve or maybe even a couple of months of thinking I'm good. I feel like I'm in an abusive relationship with my culture in that it gives me this little promise. I don't want to be too graphic in the way that I use this metaphor, but like something bad happens, I'm like, "Oh my gosh, you know what? I just need to know that this is kind of always how things happen." And then I get a slight reprieve. I think, "Oh, okay, actually, maybe it's not that bad. I'm going to be trusting again. I'm going to be happy. I'm going to be joyful." And then it happens again. And it's like, shame
Mm.
on me, shame on you. You know what? Shame on like millennials. We just need to know that things are bad. And I think most of us do. And I want to talk a little bit then about the angst as both the anxiety we've talked about. I want to talk a little bit about the response and the coping mechanisms that you and I have
Mm.
taken on as it relates to that. And also how we do that at both the start and the tail end of this generation. And then I also want to bring it into maybe even some of the career or strategic choices that we've made throughout our lives and like where there's similarity. But I think it might be a good time to take a quick break.
We mentioned friend of the pod, Matt. So now
Hmm,
let's hear some of his work.
let's play that sting.
Welcome back, folks. Hope you enjoyed that little teaser taste of the work of our very talented friend, Matt Bogdanow. So we set the stage. We laid out the track list that is the background noise of the millennial life, of millennial angst. What does that all mean and look like now for our daily lives as either elder millennials or millennials?
Yeah, so I feel like if this is an infomercial that's running late at night, and I can, in my head, I think there's so many reels and TikToks now of people like having that, I don't know, quintessential, it feels to me, millennial night where you fell asleep on the couch, but you left the volume on, and like
Mm,
suddenly you have, I'm like, what's that song? Like, how can I even live without you? Who sings that? Do you know? Rod, somebody? Don't
uh,
ask me.
Rod Stewart?
No. How am
No?
I supposed to live without you? Okay, this is
Oh,
gonna definitely get caught,
um,
but
it's not Kenny G, is it? Or
it's not Kenny G, but shout out to Kenny G. I feel like there's that quintessential moment where you stay up too late, you fall asleep on the couch, and then you wake up to this like infomercial blasting, and they always tell you if you call right now, then you'll
mm,
also get the bonus, thing for you only have to pay the shipping, but for 19.99 you don't get just one, but two hits. And so if I think like, you know, the first CD, the first sort of album of Millennial Angst is like the track list, the hits, the bonus that you get on top of
mm,
that for calling right now for 19.99 is the coping mechanism. It's like the how
mm,
then do you as a millennial respond to that? And I think I've already mentioned memes. I think millennials are really great at making fun of things because sometimes
mm.
all you can do when the world is burning around you is laugh. We've referenced this is fine, little guy, the little flame or the little dog.
And sarcasm, I feel like, is a
Sarcasm.
millennial signifier, which I don't know,
Mm,
that might be my more comment than a question about sarcasm, but
no,
yes.
and I love it. Honestly, I love it and I do, maybe it's not unique to millennials. Obviously, the duality of tragedy and comedy and, insert a theater culture critique here, is not unique, but I do think we've perfected it in a way that I have yet to
Mm,
see other generations do to the same degree. You might have like some honorable mentions from the boomers or Gen X, but I think it's like millennial humor is one way of coping. And I think that is also a byproduct of having the internet at our disposal. And so we are the first to really lean into these technologies. The creation of social
yeah.
media happens at our time, and we're using these things in a creative and artistic way that I think I'm actually pretty proud of in a lot of ways of our generation. I don't want to get into a large commentary about the utility or the usefulness. I guess they're one of the same of social media and like a lot of the destruction that's come about because alongside that track list hit is also, the way that then social media ends up contributing to misinformation, and that's kind of I would say probably maybe another B-side track list of our generation is the
Yeah.
proliferation of misinformation as a result of the technologies that we've grown up with. But I think that like a positive of that is that the creativity that then becomes the internet. I'm thinking about like Tumblr and blogs and memes and all of these kinds of things that are I think a really beautiful in totality artistic sort of expression and an outlet for creativity that hadn't been used before by previous generations that we are able to activate as a result of technology. But that's a long and poetic way for me to just be like, I love memes, man. Like fucking love memes. But then the second
Well,
part
and
of
then it's
that,
become one of the sort of jokes or commentaries on millennials that, like, long distance, you, me, Dr. Gabby, that we communicate exclusively in sending memes
right?
that are signifiers of our emotional state or just trauma bonding and
Sure. Yeah.
saying things without saying it. There's a
Yeah.
shorthand to it.
I think that's absolutely right. There's a shorthand to it. And it's just this darkness of humor that I think comes from experiencing and witnessing, feeling the consequences materially of all of these sort of shit things happening, both to our family members and the people before us. Because a lot of people, like
Mhm.
I saw my dad lose his home. I saw my friends and family lose things in the recession. I know family members that died in, these conflicts and that we've gone abroad from. Now I see the consequences of having more friends in the international community of what that has done to their home, like when the US has enacted its imperialism and its sort of colonial conquest. And it's just a whole shit show. And so how do we bond is by doubling down and saying like, let's make this funny. But then
Yeah.
I don't know about you, but the other second sort of thread that I think is that there is a lot of intentionality in millennials, which
Mm.
psychoanalyze, good or bad, about really trying to take back power because so much, at least from my experience, always feels like these things happening. And as you mentioned, like the government, the politicians, the people that are supposed to keep us safe and that are supposed to be doing things for our well-being are not. They're favoring the elites. They're favoring the banks. They're not taking care of us. There's a lot of promises that they've given us, a lot of dreams on credit. We've talked about this before on the pod that are not fulfilled that it's like, okay, well, if I know that everything around me is on fire, how do I sort of keep my own house safe? Like, how do I keep my space? How do I keep the thing that I have? How do I keep that in control? And I think that has resulted in a lot of millennials. We went to college. We were told, go to college, get a degree. You will have a good job afterwards that will enable you to do all of the things that our parents and our grandparents did of home ownership, of being able to have expendable income, being able to, if you want, have children and set them up for success and so on and so forth. And so we put a lot of intentionality, I think, in going and becoming really educated and not only just with a bachelor's degree. I think most of us have gone on to get, post-baccalaureate degrees and advanced training. Um, there's a real intentionality, I think, with millennials to try to do better and to try to we've talked about this in a previous episode this season, sort of reclaim some of the joy or things that we felt that we weren't able to
Mhm.
fully achieve either socially or because of circumstance when we were younger by leaning into our hobbies and really doubling down in, I think, being intentional in the way that we try to manufacture our own happiness and our own contentment. We are more educated as a generation. We have traveled more. There's just a lot of how do I ensure that I'm going to be okay? How do I set myself up for success? And some of that, I think, very logical conclusion of that, being educated and investing in ourselves in these ways has had an output. But then also at the same time, the other part of being a millennial is it's like, okay, I did all the things I was supposed to do. I checked all the boxes and it's still not working, i.e., the student loan debt crisis,
Mm,
the lack of affordability, the lack of being able to now get a house or to have stability in one place, the potential of conflict or wars that might both inflate prices again, but also might result in casualties here and abroad. You kind of always anticipate the shoe is going to drop. And I know this from therapy and thinking about it as like a trauma response, is I feel like we're kind of in this perpetual trauma response as a generation of we
mm,
anticipate that things are going around and they're always going to be bad. Or sometimes we feel again that little reprieve and then, shame on us because we believed it that and we got sucked it back in. But as a result, our trauma response, I think, is an extreme level of care. And then you do see this, you talked about earlier, parents having this hyper visibility now because of technology that allows them to be present with their children. And I don't want to make a comment on like parenting, but it's like we take it to the extreme in our generation where we really want to know everything. We really want to be
mm,
informed. We want to understand what's going on in our kids' lives. We want to be present. We want to make it to every single event. We want to be able to go experience all of things. We want to travel. We want to be educated. And so we really dig our feet in. Probably we double down because I think it's a trauma response of like, well, I can't control other things, but I'm going to control what I have, which is both, I think, really understandable. But then thinking about, and I don't know how much we'll talk about it this on the pod, but I do think then what inheritance are we giving the people after us? Because we inherited a
mm,
lot of systems from our parents and our grandparents. We are also the like on steroids generation of neoliberalism. And that individualism, I think also a lot of us are now reflecting of being like, wow, I'm really lonely on all of this because I have spent so much time investing in the things that I thought that I could control in my own body and my own body mind in my own circumstance, but I wasn't really thinking about other people. And now I'm kind of like popping my head up and maybe seeing it as some of us are getting older and being like, shit, like maybe we weren't thinking too much collectively. Like we were so disenchanted by collective activism that we haven't really partaken in it because it's like, well, nothing's gonna get better, so I'll control what I can control. And um
mm,
the climate is getting worse. No one's listening to us. So, that's, I think we care a lot, but I would also say it's maybe a paradox in that we have also, I think, slipped in many ways because it's like we cared too much, but we weren't caring about everyone at the same time. And I don't know if
mm,
that's what we're giving as an inheritance to the people after us, where, at least what I hear about Gen Z is like, we care too much and they just don't give a shit.
mm. Yeah. And I think what you're speaking to about millennials trying to exert power within their spheres of influence, of finding like, where can I have impact, I do think is right on. And I think we've seen a number of examples of that during the pandemic. Mutual aid took new shape. That was language that we used back in Occupy Sandy of this isn't charity, it's mutual aid. It's about sharing skills. It's about bringing experience to communities, not to be their saviors, but to build collective power there to resist disaster capitalism. I think also we haven't really mentioned our least favorite C word here on the pod today, which is capitalism. And that being the undertone of a lot of the timeline moments, the tracks that we've been talking about, is this incessant drive for accumulation of wealth for the very few, but that millennials are finding these opportunities to show up for each other, to take a stand on things. We've also seen that millennials are willing to abandon things that were meaningful when we learn that it is toxic or there are a change in policies and now we can't support it. It seems silly in the scope of this conversation to talk about Target, but Target was like the millennial sweetheart. That was like Disneyland for a lot of folks because it was a place of comfort and joy. There
Yeah.
were a lot of Friday nights when I was living in Minnesota where we'd all just gotten to the end of the work week. We would go get a beer at the Co-op brewery down the street, get a little bit of a buzz, and then we'd walk around Target for an hour.
Mm.
It was a place of like comfort and predictability, and they seemingly had good politics.
Yeah,
and
yeah.
then they threw in the dumpster very, very quickly, seemingly with little concern, with little regret. And millennials turned on them almost immediately. And
Hmm.
it has been devastating for targets for their business. And great,
Yeah.
fuck them.
And if you add before you, I think I would add one foil to that, in that when I talk about care and caring too much versus not, maybe a different framing that I'll offer, and then I want to keep hearing Dr. Brett's take on this, because listeners, it's usually way better than mine. But I
Different,
I think
better.
loyalty is really important to millennials, what you're talking about, which is
Mm,
Target demonstrated that all of the things that they said that they felt, like, we're very causal, right? I think about like Tom's or other companies that were like, we're going to do something, we want to make money, but we're going to give back. Like, we are here with a mission and a purpose. And so thinking about like everything being mission oriented, like a lot of startups in our
yeah.
generation from like the early to mid aughts. I think loyalty and being connected to a purpose and kind of a soul, if you will, is also very important. And so that, like, when a company like Target demonstrates that, like, oh, as soon as this is like maybe not profitable for us, or we aren't obligated anymore because the political tides have changed, and we drop you like a stone, then millennials, I think, also will drop you, because for us, like, I think maybe it comes back to loyalty of like, hey, we want you to care about
Mm,
something because we care about something. And when you demonstrate that you don't have a value set, we are less inclined to give you our financial capital.
yeah. And I think exactly that. And another example that comes to mind is Starbucks. Starbucks very anti union, anti worker, and millennials are very, very pro worker and are
And very
very pro
pro
union.
Israel.
Starbucks is also pro
Starbucks.
Israel, and that was another huge um, catalyst in a lot of boycotts against
Mhm.
Starbucks. And so I also think about technologies and how technologies or platforms that are incredibly meaningful. You mentioned Tumblr was a place of maybe the original outlet for millennial angst. I also think about LiveJournal, these
Oh
places where
yeah.
folks are connecting with one another, they are screaming into the void.
Hmm.
Then Twitter. But when these platforms change values, or now what we're facing is that so many of these platforms are becoming surveillance tools for the
Yeah.
state, for anti-immigration, for all of these campaigns of evil. But like I think about Tumblr, and when they made the choice to become pretty explicitly anti-sex work, and Tumblr was a place of before OnlyFans, where content creators were exploring a wider range of topics that aren't PG, that was like kink friendly, and was a more expansive approach to sex and sexuality and identity.
Mhm.
And when Tumblr became an unsafe place for that, people left it, and a lot of people left it in solidarity with
Yeah.
sex workers. And obviously, Twitter, we've seen there was a mass exodus, not immediately when Elon took over, but definitely when Trump 2.0 started. Same with Facebook. And it's these ways, like you're saying, where millennials can feel, there's a lot that I don't have control, but I can control over how I spend my time, what I give my attention, what I passively support through ads. And I'm not going to continue utilizing platforms in which I don't feel good about my engagement. I mentioned the backdrop of climate disaster here and what we've inherited. And we inherited a broken economy and a world on fire. And millennials are doing what we can without having been given the levers of power. We're starting to see that now with like Mayor Mamdani, with
Mhm.
AOC. We have some younger generations starting to get closer to those levers of power, but we haven't been given the big ones yet. And
No.
we have folks who are going to be sitting on the Supreme Court for potentially decades longer that are going to make a lot of things continue to be difficult to access true power, but we do what we can within our spheres of influence. And I've mentioned very early, I think in season 1, talking about the work that I do, where it is a privilege that I get to work with college students. And a lot of my work is defying my own despondency, because in a lot of ways I have given up on this world, but I haven't given up on them. And that was what I said in that pod. And that I do, last week I talked about faith. I do have a lot of faith that they are going to make tangible difference in the world. And I think it is through this work that I've also reconciled a little bit of, for a long time, I wanted kids. And then at some point that turned for me, particularly during my engagement with Occupy Wall Street and then Sandy and then the next like decade, where coming to understand climate disaster, it felt irresponsible to me to bring a kid into this world and force them to inherit the world that we have let come to be. And I still struggle with that thought. Can't say for sure that kids are off the table for me, but it's not terribly likely, and it is not a strong desire. But that's one of the reasons why I do like and feel a responsibility to work with college age folks, because they are at that pivotal transition moment where they get to decide who they want to be as an adult and what is the work that they're going to take on. And so I'm trying to encourage them and give them strong foundations to take on that work, to really be that change that we need.
Yeah. No, I feel very kindred in that, and that, my work in education is both inspired by wanting to work with students and enable them to think critically and to be well informed, to contribute themselves in whichever way that they can, and the like sort of the lane that they choose to contribute meaningfully. I was a part of a lot of stuff YMCA in high school, a couple of years in undergrad, and there was always a motto in the particular group that I worked with, which was Youth in Government, YAG or YIG, depending on where you are in the United States, was one of the things we always taught. And it's part of a core value of the YMCA is like, you leave it better than you found it. And I think that's very much part of what energizes me in the work that I do, as much as the research or the things that I usually spend my time thinking and writing about are like still trying to convince people about, the bullshit and like the structures underneath that we're not taking seriously enough. But when I think about students, is it's like I think that there's such an opportunity when you're working with people, and not even just people underneath you, because in a public institution that I work at, I have students at all sort of dimensions or cross sections of life. So it is people that are 18 and just coming right out, but it's also folks that are returning professionals working. I've
Mm.
had people 3 times my age that have been in my classroom, and it's always really fun, but it's instilling a value of leaving it better than you found it, which is not to get on like my soapbox and say like, oh my gosh, I'm doing things perfectly, but it's just one of those ways that it's like, again, like what can I control in my life? And it's like trying to actively activate levers or things in contrast to what I feel and see, which is like the chaos and the fire of the world. But then also in my profession, it's always been really important to me. We've talked about being ambitious to sort of serve those particular individual needs, but then also making sure that whatever I do or however like I walk through the world is hopefully leaving it better than I found it. But I was, like it's really complicated. I mean, we are all enmeshed in the tendrils of capitalism. And like you said, I mean, the people that are entrusted with most of the power still are not giving those reins to us. Or I think about a lot of the people that were there doing that work, the sort of the non-sexy work, at least in this country, had a mass firing as a result of Doge and this administration. And those
Mm.
people were of our generation. Those are civil servants that don't get their due credit. Those are my friends and colleagues in DC that I saw walking on the subway with their boxes, going home without a job. Like those are access points that are continuously denied. So again, this like metaphor of the wave that I'm coming back to is it's like wanting to think globally, thinking bigger, thinking about my connection to the future, what you were talking about as it relates to climate crisis and like what comes after me. But I do see a lot of millennials with this charge of trying to contribute better, because there does feel like this collective responsibility that we need to do more than what was given to us, even if this is like shit. Like we
Mhm.
do owe more to the future for ourselves, because like we want some respite. I think something about millennials is that like because we've experienced so much, we are one of the generations for the first time with a mass influx of care and thought and attentiveness to mental health, and to sort of,
Mm.
as you said earlier, maybe even unlearning a lot of things or realizing, oh, you know what, that was the wrong approach. We shouldn't inherit this kind of racist, sexist, homophobic language. We need to change. We need to be open to embracing diversity, to positionality. We need to unlearn the Islamophobia that was rampant in this country and still is as a product of 9/11, but even prior to that. I mean, I think like
Mhm.
there is a part of our generation that I'm proud of in that sense. You know, this starts with the internet in this moment with social media and everything that's going on too.
Yeah.
I think a lot of people understandably are now maybe checking out. They're losing hope. We talked last week about utopias, about this ongoing process that requires engagement, it requires labor. And yeah, that's emotionally exhausting, that's physically exhausting, depending on where you are activated in those kinds of struggles. And so the angst is, I think, and sometimes really righteous and really well fueled and really intentional with our generation. But I also know that like angst eventually doesn't always activate or lead towards movement because you got to be a pretty like intense trained swimmer, which I think most of us are as millennials, to like fight against the current. But we all get tired and not everybody, you know, understandably like you can't that momentum can't go on in perpetuity for
Mhm.
most of us. And I think one thing that I'm curious about because of your particular background, but also just your thoughts of like where I was starting this conversation was thinking about like wanting to establish roots and being unsatisfied with our lack of ability to buy homes because we all bought too many Starbucks coffees and avocado toast like 5 years ago. So like, you know, we just, you
Mhm.
know, I guess now we're reaping what we sowed or sowing what we ripped or insert the metaphor of like because I do think that millennials also will, as much as we care about other people, will go back into our shells and try to control ourselves and
Mhm.
contribute to neoliberalism also in some of the worst ways. When I'm talking to people about like, oh, I want to move, I would love to buy a house, but then also what's important is like where I'm at in the neighborhood and the community that's around me
Yeah.
is angst is something that I do think we've felt collectively, but I don't know as we've activated that angst collectively in a way that we've seen results. And a lot of that is systematic and structural and waves that are like coming against us. But I'm also really curious about maybe how you think about, or if you think about then like how to be better, like what we can be doing better as a generation of activating that angst in a way that provides tangible results to change or create the futures and demanding, we've been asking, we've been pleading since all of this started for us.
Sometimes the angst moves us into action, and sometimes the angst requires that we retreat and we regroup and we get some energy back. And sometimes that is through our silly little hobbies or the things that bring us joy, which is not silly. But I think what we're learning is that while we strive to make a difference on the global scale, and often that is where we feel most ineffective. And I think we will see that in the coming weeks to try to impact and lessen what is going to be happening in Iran and beyond. But I think at the same time, what is still going on and often just getting less coverage is anti-ice resistance on the neighborhood scale is continuing. Folks are fighting back, trying to prevent their neighbors, their community members from being abducted and disappeared. There is active resistance continuing in Minneapolis. We talked about a few episodes ago, and it is happening in ways that feel genuine to the community. It's
Mm.
not just marches and rallies. It's not riots this time. It's singing, it's dance, it's throwing dildos at the detention center. It is things that feel particularly genuine that are also enlivening to the folks who are going through it. And this was a quote that I almost brought up last week in the episode, but there's a quote from Emma Goldman, who's one of the early anarchist theorists and scholars and activists. And she said, if I can't dance in your revolution, then I don't want to be a part of it, meaning that there has to be joy. Revolution cannot just be doom and gloom because it is about building the new world in the shell of the one we are tearing down. And so, yes, we can and need to be enraged by what we're seeing, but if we can bring levity into it, not only is that sustaining for us, it's also disempowering to fascism and oppression because
Yeah.
they cannot fathom joy, because a life that is only about accumulating wealth is because they are rotten and hollow inside and they're trying to fill it with the least meaningful thing that has ever existed, and that is money. And so millennials are finding ways to create that balance. And that's the only way that it's going to be sustaining is, as we've been talking about in different ways, working within our communities and showing up for one another in ways that give us life in the face of these incessant death merchants.
Oh, I think that's a really great point because, I mean, yeah, shout out to Minneapolis, who actually the city just received a nomination for the first time as a city for the Nobel Peace Prize. I don't know if you saw that. Shout out to the frogs in Portland and the absurdity of Portland, who very successfully drove ICE out of their communities by engaging in very joyful, absurd forms of protest. Like you said, it was very funny to watch. Don't know how to respond to that. They really don't understand. It's sort of
Or telling ICE
the
officers,
kryptonite.
like, just kiss already,
Yeah,
is
yeah.
fucking hilarious. Just chanting at them, like, or when they're getting up in protesters' faces and being like, you really want to kiss me right now, don't you? Like, you see their brains malfunction.
Or we didn't get a chance to talk too much about it. The most recent halftime show with Bad Bunny, which was a very defiant political act. It was using art as activism, but it was based in joy, which you saw MAGA in particular up to that create their own halftime show. Shake all the angry fists, use all the levers of social media and X and Twitter and all these kinds of things that they like to do to complain about how anti-American it could be. And then for there to be a 12-minute demonstration that was pure joy. And the lack
Yeah.
of response or rebuttal to that is that they just couldn't. They couldn't, like you said, wrap their brains around that. But it also disarmed and dismantled that in a way that was so powerful. And I think that's why so many people who maybe even weren't big fans of Bad Bunny before, like there's a reason why, the dude's streaming went up immensely because it was such a joyous demonstration where even you could transcend in that moment. Like joy transcended language, it transcended culture,
Mm.
bias, all of these things that you didn't have to understand what someone was saying to understand what someone was feeling and trying to put across. And so I think that's a really powerful point is that you are the merchant or the purveyor of despair, Dr. Brett. I am with you, sort of surviving out of spite purely most of the time, and just two little angry people. I would say generally, no one has ever said like, "Oh, Nicole's a really happy lady,
Mm.
happy kid." I've gotten evil. I've never gotten happy, but I do think that this, whether it's at the base just a meme or something that brings you joy and happiness is something that I think we can work on enacting and thinking about millennial angst as also being at times like a desperate cry asking for spaces of joy because they're not always organically given to us or they're
Mhm.
denied to many of us, but then also like being a very intentional part, as I think you and I both have talked about today, about like our generation of how we get through it together.
Yeah. I may be an angry person, but it has been described as a righteous anger. And that is something I am quite proud of. And I think on that note, we will take a little break, listen to the jazzy tunes of Matt Bogdanow, getting a lot of shout
Musical
outs today.
stylings. Yeah.
And we will be back for our closing segment. More comment than a question.
Okay, welcome back, folk. Ending, as we always do, with a little section we like to call More Comment Than a Question. Dr. Brett, this week my comment is one that's been told over and over and over again, which is ladies' sizing in clothes is absolutely
Mm.
ridiculous. If you buy clothes that are labeled as gendered for women, absolute bonkers, no consistency. I think about it in that if I buy a pair of pants, probably for you, or let's say for my partner, all they have to do is give me their waist and length, like 32, 34 or whatever. I don't know, like 42, insert a
Whoa,
number of
humble brag right
combinations.
there.
Yeah, okay. Shout out to 32, 34. You know who you are. But like that's great. It's always the same. It's going to be the same everywhere. And I'm sure that there's sometimes, I don't want to speak for you, but like if you're trying on menswear, a little bit of variation in fit. But no matter where I go, it's always different. And anyway, this is boiling to me because I bought a pair of tights yesterday in my size, thinking they were my size. Put them on, they ripped. Nope, they were not my size. And then
Mm.
I was walking around the mall this past weekend, classic millennial, teen thing, walking around the mall,
Mm.
which as an adult, I must say I hate. That's not my comment. I was going in all these stores and I just felt like such an idiot because I spent 2 hours trying on pants and no store had the same articulation of like what pants in my size would be. And it's a struggle. If you're out there, I see you, I'm with you. And yeah, it just sucks. Do better, ladies, or people that are designing women's wear. Like, y'all need to get it together.
I won't comment on your comment, but I will share solidarity on your comment.
Thank you.
So over the last like 4 or 5 days, from last Thursday through Sunday, I think, I've spent collectively probably 5 hours on the phone with insurance company and medical providers trying to make a handful of appointments. It's one medical group, that my primary care doctor and all my specialists, and every department has their own booking phone number. So I can't just call one booking line and say, hey, my doctor put in these 4 referrals. I need to make appointments. I got to call every single one. I got to sit on hold with each one. Sometimes I got to wait for callbacks. I got to go back and forth about approvals and yada, yada. And it is just really disappointing that in the year of our Lord, 2020, can't do better. Like, obviously, I know healthcare in this country is a mess. The fact that I even have it is a gift, and I should not be complaining about that. But it is evident of why, as a culture, we are so unhealthy when we make it so difficult to access care, even if you have coverage, that it is so difficult. And there was one appointment with a neurologist that I got one mid-April, and the booking agent that I was talking to was like, you got lucky here. And it was over a month out. And I was like, really? And she was like, yeah, someone must have just canceled because I don't have anything else after this date until the summer or 2027. And I was like, that is fucked.
Yeah.
So I will not be missing that appointment, but we got to do better. And maybe Gen Z will figure it out.
Well, also in solidarity. Well, with that, folks, that's the end of this week's episode. Appreciate if you would hit that like and subscribe, smash it. I cannot tell you how much it actually means. I know we say this every pod, but adding your endorsement just provides us more visibility. We're trying to grow our audience on the pod. We see who's listening. We see the number. It's helpful when others see that as well, and that's why you gotta like and subscribe, smash those buttons. And as we've been saying this season, if something on the pod resonated with you, if you thought, oh, I know so and so would like this, or you know what, this is a good topic that I should send to a friend, share that pod. That is our challenge. We would like to grow our audience and get more people engaged. So if you found it meaningful, share the pod. Folks, will be back next week. Take care of yourself. There's a lot going on in the world this week. Wherever you are, be safe, and we will be in your ear sooner than you think.
Talk to y'all soon. Doc to Doc is co-hosted, written, produced, and edited by us, Dr. Brett S. Goldberg and Dr. Nicole K. Mayberry. Our original music was written and performed by Matt Bogdanow, and our original artwork was illustrated by Andre Gonzalez. Doc to Doc is an independent podcast and a conversation across place, perspective, and friendship. We record Doc to Doc between Washington, D.C. and Orange County, California. In Washington, D.C., we record on the ancestral lands of the Nacotchtank Anacostans, also known as the Anacostan or Nacotchtank peoples, and near the lands of the Piscataway and Pamunkey peoples. In Orange County, we record on the traditional and unceded lands and waters of the Hashiman and Tongva tribal nations.